Hi, let's check out how to find the maximum or minimum of a quadratic function. What we'll do is I'll try an example problem here on the left, and then I'll get you to try the same steps with your own problem here on the right, and I'll post the solution when you're ready. So let's go ahead and have a look at the first practice problem. It's a short one. Determine the maximum or minimum of the function y equals 3x squared minus 6x plus 8. Now, before we just jump in and solve it, I can see that we're going to have a little bit of work to do. And that's because this equation is given in standard form, which is fine. But the problem with standard form is that it's not very easy to see where a maximum or minimum value is. So we have to convert this into a form that's nicer for us to read for finding a maximum or minimum value. So let's do that with step 1. This is where completing the square is a really handy tool for problems that involve a maximum or minimum value. So I'm going to go ahead and start completing the square on the equation that's given. Now, if you're not sure of my steps, please check out an earlier clip on completing the square, and it should help you out. But the first thing I'm doing here is I'm common factoring out the 3 from the first two terms. And you can see I've been left with this inside of a bracket. And the last term, that plus 8, stays by itself in the first line. Next, I'm going to look at this minus 2. So I'll write what I have so far, but when I get to the minus 2, I need to take half of minus 2 and then square that. Half of minus 2 is minus 1, so negative 1. And negative 1 squared, negative 1 times negative 1, makes positive 1. So what I do inside the bracket is I just write it once with a positive and once with a minus. In effect, what I'm doing is creating a weird looking 0 inside of a bracket because plus 1 and minus 1 makes a 0. On this next line, what I want to do is bring the negative 1 outside of the bracket and put it right here. But before I can just bring it outside the bracket, I have to multiply it by the 3 in front. So that will make negative 3. Everything else is going to stay the same. I still have my negative 2x, and that plus 1 stays inside the bracket. But here I have a negative 3, and then I keep my positive 8. Now keep your eye on this area here when you're doing your completing the square, because it's very important for the maximum or minimum value, and you'll see why in just a moment. But the next thing I'm going to do is actually put those two numbers together. So negative 3 and a positive 8 will give me a positive 5. The last step for completing the square is to simplify this quadratic that's inside the bracket. And to do that, I'll show you. It's going to be a perfect square quadratic, which means I can sum it up with just two terms instead of the 3 that are inside here. I take the square root of the first term, x squared, the square root of that is just x. Then I take the sine of the middle term, which is negative. Then I take the square root of the last term, and the square root of 1 is just 1. And I add a squared exponent to the right bracket. And that's how I simplify a perfect squared quadratic. And I keep my 5 on the end. Okay, great. So that's finished. I've completed the square and converted a quadratic function from standard form into this form, which allows me to see the maximum or minimum value. And that'll be in step 2. Look at the first and last numbers. Those are the important numbers. So what's the first number? Well, that's the first number I see here, right in front. It's a positive 3. Now the positive is important. If it's a positive number in front, it means it's going to open upwards. My quadratic or parabola shape will look like a U. And that means I'm going to have a minimum value. If this were a negative number, it would open downwards, sort of like a lowercase n, meaning I'd have a maximum value. But now, what is the minimum value of this quadratic? Well, that's where the last number becomes very important. This is the minimum value of my quadratic function. In other words, I have a minimum at y equals 5. So just to review, if you want to find the maximum or minimum of a function, you need to take it from standard form and complete the square on it to put it into this form. The first number will tell you whether you have a maximum or minimum. If it's a positive number, you'll have a minimum. If it's a negative number, you'll have a maximum. And the last number tells you the value of that minimum or maximum. So in this case, we had a minimum at y equals 5. Okay, grab your paper and pencil, and let's see if you can apply the same steps for this function. Find the maximum or minimum of this, y equals 2x squared minus 12x plus 15. So try that now, and I'll post a solution when you're ready. Hopefully you got a minimum value of y equals 3. And if you didn't, take a look at these steps for completing the square, because this is where a lot of little errors can happen. And if all went well, you got a minimum of y equals 3.